For this episode, we have Rob Futrick. He was the co-founder and CTO of Cloud Cycle?
Cycle Computing.
Bro. So he's the co-founder and CTO of Cycle Computing. And then he moved on and worked, actually got acquired by Microsoft and worked at Microsoft for a while. And then he was the CTO of Anaconda. So without me introducing himself, I'll let him do it himself.
Yeah, no, I was just saying the number of times people called us Cloud Cycle and all kinds of variations between the company name and the product name is totally normal. But yeah, man, I started, I guess, in the tech scene / entrepreneurship scene back in the late 90s. So I'm actually currently co-founder and VP of engineering of another startup in the Seattle area. This is my third time. But like you said, Cycle Computing is how I got to Seattle in the first place. Microsoft acquired us and we moved up here to be kind of at the mothership. And then I left and joined Anaconda for a while, which was a wild ride. And oddly enough, I used to live in Austin, Texas, where Anaconda's headquartered. And so I moved up here and then ended up having to commute back down there. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to chat.
Of course, we're really excited to have him on the podcast. So before we get into your journey, let's get started with where you started at Cornell. How was it like studying there? How was the culture there?
Oh gosh, so I have a non-typical background, which I actually now kind of hope is helpful to others. So I didn't start programming until I was a senior in high school, and I didn't own a computer. And I took a class in BASIC and Pascal languages. It was not a rigorous software class, so I would actually say I didn't really start programming until I got to college. And weirdly enough, I wasn't intending to be a software person. I was intending to be a patent lawyer. Oh. And so I was studying CS as a prereq to going to law school. But that was really driven by, if I'm being blunt, I was babysat by this family growing up, and the father was outrageously successful. So when we get dropped off at this mansion, like out of a movie with the staircases and marble and chandeliers. And so I was like 10 years old or whatever. I was like, what do you do? He's like, let me tell you, I'm a patent attorney, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, I think I could do that. But I got to college and realized just how much I really liked doing software, even though it was a new thing. And felt if I'm gonna work, in crazy hours and put myself into something, it might as well be something that I'm excited about doing. And so yeah, I don't regret it at all. But I had a lot of catch up. So my college experience was not fantastic because I overloaded myself to catch up to people who've been programming since they were this high. So I didn't really get the most out of university. I would recommend others at university take advantage of like the learning environment that you're in and really soak it up, and take advantage of the social environment that you're in, because you're never going to be in that level of density of people that isn't like a work environment again. And I was a little too focused on studies and work and projects and things like that. I was stressed about them too much. But I'd say the culture there was actually great. It meshed with me. I have nothing bad to say about it. I ended up dropping out. Oh. So took an entrepreneurship class, met another gentleman. He's actually been my co-founder 3 times now. And he had gone to school with like the mission of like, I'm going to start a tech company. And we hit it off and we're partners in a lot of classes, and he's brilliant. And he kept convincing me like, we have a good idea, let's start this now. And I was like, no. And I talked to my parents, who were shockingly like, yeah, you should totally drop out. And so like, what's the risk? Which I guess would be the theme, is like, always be aware of kind of the risk reward. Like, I was young, I was healthy, I had no dependents, I could live on very little money. Like, I had all the profile of like, yeah, take a risk. And so I was kind of shocked by their support. So I went and talked to my faculty advisor, and he was like, of course you should drop out. And I was like, oh my God. So I was like, if everybody's telling me this, I'm gonna do it. So yeah, I did. And that startup failed. It's a whole story in and of itself.
I was about to ask you that after this.
Yeah, it was a great experience. Everybody always says that, but it was with some pretty key lessons, and but it really formed kind of a tight bond among a bunch of the mostly engineers at that company, and then we've continued to work together and or be friends, ever since. And then that startup led to kind of a circuitous, weird journey at the end. Actually led to the founding of the second one a couple years later, and then that was the long one. It was 12 years from start to acquisition, and then I worked for Microsoft for the 5.5 years. So I was in that job for 17 years, which is an eternity in the tech world.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, 17 years is a lot. But before we get into that, I mean
obviously the role shifted.
Yeah, so of course it did. So before we get into that, let's talk about you and immersive technology.
Yeah.
Right? So can you explain to us like what the company did?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd say the key thing there was we were the classic mistake of being really cool technology that was kind of in search of a business at the beginning. And we made all the mistakes, despite reading the books telling us don't make these mistakes. We were looking, we're like, we're not making any of those. We were making all of them, but that's okay. So Immersive Technologies started off as basically a renderer. So trying to create images out of digital scenes. But the key kind of where we ended up was it was a realistic renderer. So we had physics-based models for the surface models, and we had a global illumination for the lighting. And in software, we were at least an order of magnitude
Was
faster.
it in 3D?
Oh yeah. I mean, you could do computer games with this, movies. We were actually aimed at high-end automotive, high-end manufacturing. So at the time, I think they still do, but at the time in the late 90s, auto companies would make physical prototypes of potential cars just to see how they looked. They'd make front quarter panels and interiors, and then they just millions and millions and millions of dollars, mostly just to see if things looked good, looked nice, etc. And so what our software at the time was like, look, give us your actual CAD models, give us lighting models, surface models, things like that, and we'll generate an image that's photorealistic. Not in the like, I've taken Photoshop and made it look cool. It was supposed to look like it would look in reality if you actually made this thing. So we could go into the technical details, but they're not that important. But the key thing was, my co-founder had this, they actually, one of the few patents that survived the company was we had a novel spatial subdivision algorithm that allowed us to have massive geometries, but still render them very, very fast. And so, like I said, at the time, we were about an order of magnitude faster, at least, than anything else out there. And it also was very, very amenable to hardware. So everybody's familiar with NVIDIA and everything nowadays, but like at the time, you had 3DFX and ATI and NVIDIA and the other companies. And fun story, we actually tried to use an NVIDIA, or actually I think it was 3DFX card to do some of the calculations, but they weren't able to do it like they can do today. But anyway, so we were going to raise money to implement an accelerator card. And then if you were one of these companies, you could buy our software, buy our card, and you could mostly in real time see images of what your stuff would look like in reality and save millions of dollars. But the .com crash hit. We were going to raise a second round of funding, and we lost all of our customers in like a 2-month period because we weren't a .com, but like Ford, GM, Audi, BMW, all the auto companies started bleeding money. If I remember correctly, you should double check this, but I think Ford had made like several billion in profit in like the year 2000 or 2001, and then in like 2002 they lost like $1 billion. So like we basically lost all our customers at once. But we had done a cool project with Disney. So they had a movie, I'll be quick about this, but they had a movie that I believe at the time was supposed to be Mel Gibson. He was going to play himself at multiple periods of his own life. And they didn't have any software that could make realistic looking skin. Even Pixar at the time, if you look at their movies, it was all plastic and metal, stuff that reflected, that had a hard shell. So what our software could do is something called subsurface scattering, which is it would simulate the light going into a translucent object like marble, wax, skin, etc., simulate it bouncing around and coming out. And so we could make really beautiful stuff that looked real. I actually argued against the project because I was like, we're not a movie company, we're going for manufacturing, we don't have the resources to do both. I got overruled. And we did a 2-month POC. We passed the POC, the proof of concept, with them. We got on the phone with them, and I'd say they were crying, but it was more they were clearly upset. And they told us, hey, the movie's been canceled. All that work you did is for nothing. Sorry about that. But the technical director in the film went to Pixar. She bounced around a couple years later. She called up my co-founder, a gentleman named Jason Stowe, and said, hey, I remember this really cool work you guys did for us a couple years ago. Would you come work with me on a new film, help run the technology stack to build this film up? And he was working for a company at the time and wanted a new challenge and was like, sure. So he went up to Toronto with his girlfriend, now wife, and they built up the technology stack to run the render farm for this movie production. And it was based on open source software, which 2004, different world as far as open source. You had Canonical and Red Hat and things like that, but it wasn't what it is now. And went to a conference and talked about what he had done. And some people in the audience were like, we want to use that software, we have those problems. It's not movies, it's financial calculations, but like, would you come work with us? And he said, no, but I have a company that, you could contract our company to do the work. And then they said, that sounds great. And then he called me and said, we're starting another company. So that's how the second one formed. That's how Cycle Computing formed. But it was a pre-cloud company that focused on adding enterprise features, enterprise support for open source software. Again, 2004, 2005, that was not common. And there was a company called JBoss that had been acquired by Oracle, and that was our model for this could be a real business model thing. And we started off pre-cloud, but then the cloud came about, and we quickly realized that it was a perfect fit for a lot of our customers early on. So we were incredibly early adopters of AWS services because they were the only cloud at the time. And that quickly came to dominate our entire business. Like very quickly, everything just went cloud, and that was that.
That was a great story. Thank you so much for sharing.
Also, that movie, by the way,
Yeah.
Gemini Man. If you remember a Will Smith movie from like 10 years ago, it did get made eventually, but it had gone through the normal development stuff, which is, again, small world coincidence cracks me up that like, Jason called me, he's like, dude, they're making Gemini Man. It's like, oh, yeah. So anyway, it did get made, but without our software.
Oh man, that's...
Yeah.
So it was kind of like Blender at the time, right?
Yes, it would have been a plug-in to something like Blender.
So it's like a separate rendering engine?
Yeah, entirely separate rendering engine. We plugged into Maya and Alias Wavefront, and I can't remember the name of all the different software things we did anymore, but we had all of them, and we were a plug-in. But we really focused on the high-end manufacturing, so we started focusing, I think it was called Auto Studio, software that costs like $100,000 a license, that kind of stuff. Not the normal like desktop stuff.
And and you mentioned briefly how cloud, cycle computing started, right?
Yep.
Is there more to the story and how they
Well, we
grow?
bootstrapped that. So that, and I would definitely recommend people think more about that, which is funny because our current startup is VC funded. But the original immersive, we had investment, and at the end it got a little ugly. The investors were fighting amongst each other and whatnot. And so we decided to like, hey, maybe we can do this without investors, which really wasn't the right lesson to take away, but touch a hot stove kind of a thing. So we bootstrapped that company, which had its own sets of challenges. And we were fully remote too, which again, another thing sounds common now, but there was no Zoom, there was no Teams, there was no Slack, there was none of that stuff. So it was very interesting to have a fully remote, fully distributed company for 12 years up until we got acquired.
So it was fully remote the whole time?
Yep.
That's amazing. And how did the acquisition with Microsoft go? Like,
great.
What did you guys consider during the acquisition? I mean, most of the people watching right now, if they're starting a startup, they want to get acquired, but they want to actually. Not many people know actually like how to consider a good acquisition versus a bad.
Yeah.
acquisition.
Oh God, we could do a whole discussion just on that.
Yeah.
I'd say the key things are a couple things. You can do the route of like I want to be acquired, but you will have much more success if you go the route of I want to build a successful business, and then focus on that. We were lucky. We had several people that were trying to acquire us, which is a great situation to be in. But the key thing is that you want to be one of the ways you can get acquired is to be a really good partner, and to solve a problem that the companies either don't solve or that kind of fits in between things they do, or there's a whole bunch of different ways where you can kind of partner. But you almost always start off having a good business, and then you can partner with a whatever kind of firm you're talking about, and together you have some kind of a strong offering, and eventually they are like, well, this would be so much better if we were just working together. This is kind of a perfect fit. It's not the only way, but that, to me, if you focus on just getting acquired, like if your mission is I want to build a company to get acquired, it's a bit, first of all, if the acquisition doesn't happen, you better have a good business. And second of all, you're much more attractive to people if you're a solid business, solid technology, solid team, if you have some kind of a capability that really adds to them. And sometimes in the race to just get acquired, you can overlook building up some of those characteristics. So it's just my perspective. So I always look to build or invest in or whatever a solid business, and then if something happens, great.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you had multiple companies that wanted to acquire you, and what would you consider while picking the
Yeah,
business?
good question. So we didn't purely consider money. It really depends. So for instance, many years ago, I worked for a small software company. The owners were fabulous. I took a lot of lessons from working there. To my own kind of personal philosophy of how I want to treat people and run a business and things like that. And they got acquired, and part of the reason, if I'm remembering correctly, was they had a lot of their competitors get acquired, and they were worried that they were going to become too small a fish in this industry they were in. And so they really loved the business they had built, and they wanted to see it continue. And so my understanding is they also did a similar thing where it was like, we're not looking for the biggest check, we're looking for people that are going to help us be the most successful. And so that kind of influenced us. It wasn't just what's going to make us rich or anything like that. It was how do we have the most impact? How do we make the most out of this? And how do we make sure the entire team is taken care of? Sometimes during acquisition discussions, you'll have somebody come in and say, "Oh, we want to buy your technology," but you can get a clear sense. Either they'll tell you a clear sense they're going to lay off like the whole team. So things like that were deal breakers. So if you weren't going to take care of the team, we were out. And being bootstrapped, we were able to be more generous with equity across the company, and so it was a much more happy day for everyone. Sometimes you see other situations where, because of the number of rounds of funding and things like that, some people make a ton, some people get very little. It's just the numbers. So we looked at where is the best business fit? Where could we be a much bigger company years later with the resources? Microsoft had enterprise sales. I think they told us like 10,000 salespeople, and we have relationships with every company on earth. And we, being a bootstrapped company, we were basically all engineering with a tiny sales, almost no marketing. And so for us, it was, okay, great, you're gonna bring enterprise sales, you're gonna bring enterprise marketing, you're gonna bring even support, you're gonna bring all these things that we couldn't really bootstrap. And we're gonna bring a solid product and a solid technology team and an understanding of the industry and the brand. And it felt like a perfect marriage. And that's actually how it worked out really well.
Wow, so you basically think about what the company can do for the company, not just the check number, and see if like your team is actually a good fit with them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see, that's really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not judging people who come at it differently. It was just that our calculus was, what is the best likelihood of success and kind of the marriage, if you will. Yeah, there's all kinds of intricacies in acquisitions, and they all go different ways. Like sometimes you have things called earnouts, where if you don't hit certain business metrics after acquisition, it can retroactively affect how much you get. Sometimes they don't have any kind of protections about being laid off, and so you hear horror stories, people get acquired and they get a bunch of stuff, but it doesn't, their stuff doesn't vest for 2 years and they're all laid after. Like you get all kinds of weird things. And so for me, I focus on, if we can show real business success, then it's a win-win for everybody. And so we were looking for the best partnership there.
I see. And can you describe like what your product with
Yeah, absolutely. So we focus on what they called high performance computing or high throughput computing. We can get into the details of that another time. But the general idea is, if you want to use a lot of computers to solve a problem, there's generally two categories. You have, I want to do a million different calculations. They're all independent. It's almost like if you were a professor and you had to grade exams and you had several teaching assistants, you could just divide the exams up amongst them and say, you grade 25, you grade 25, whatever. So the more teaching assistants you have, the faster they all get done. So for financial companies, they want to do risk calculations, or they want to do all kinds of different models and whatnot. Not AI models, but like financial models. They might want to do 1 million of them. Well, great. We'll give you 10,000 computers, and it's going to take one 100th of the time, or whatever, that kind of thing. Computational biology. There's a bunch of problems where you just have to do a ton of calculations, but you can just throw resources at it. It's kind of a volume of work to get done. There are other calculations like physics simulations and training AI models and others where you need all these resources, but if any one of them fails, the whole thing fails. It's kind of all interdependent. And that's more typical high performance computing. And then you hear these like giant Cray supercomputers back in the day and these giant systems, they tend to be talking about high performance computing. So we did both. And what we would do is we would make it very easy for people to define and then deploy these machines inside of like an AWS. And so things like that have come a long way in the cloud, but at the beginning days, just getting 100 machines, making sure the storage was correct, that they were all functioning, they had the right software, they were all talking, and then actually getting the work onto them and then spinning them up when you need more, spinning them down, auto scaling, that was all super challenging. And so our stuff made a push button. You could basically template out your environment and say go. And we used to work closely with AWS and Azure and others, but early on it was AWS. There were times where even AWS infrastructure couldn't keep up, which they were happy about. It helped load test their system. So we did I think we made the New York Times for doing this, what they call like the mega run. I don't remember the names right now. We used 136,000 cores, so not computers but cores at the time, which was groundbreaking. But I think at one point they were like, S3 in Brazil is having problems, stop using it. So we would push the scale boundaries of what people could do. And then the idea is if I can spin up 100,000 cores regularly, well then when you need 10,000, it's trivial. But yeah, and so over the years we just kept pushing the boundaries there. And at Azure, one of the things that they had that differentiated them from the other cloud providers was they had actual HPC hardware. They had something called InfiniBand networking. InfiniBand was made by Mellanox that NVIDIA acquired 7 years ago or something like that. But they basically had the hardware to actually run some of these workloads that really weren't possible at the time in the other cloud providers. And so that was one of the reasons why it was a good fit again, was that they had kind of underlying technologies that we could help drive. And then we participated in helping push a lot of that stuff forward at Azure while we were there.
So, and when did the shift from AWS to Azure happen?
Probably the mid-teen, 2014, I don't know, somewhere in that time frame. And it was a couple things. One, we went where our customers told us to go. And so we started having more and more demand to run things in other providers. And it became harder and harder to kind of only be AWS, mostly just because we do what our customers want. And so early on, we had actually had a SaaS offering. Enterprises didn't want that. Enterprises wanted control of the data. They wanted things deployed on-prem. And so we rewrote our software to be an actual, you install it and you run it and then we'd support them. And so then it was like, well, we're running this and we happen to be Azure customers, or we want to use both. And actually, we actually had a product capability for a while where you could kind of split workloads up and stuff like that. And then the more we did on these, the more Azure, I don't know if you remember, Microsoft had this like Microsoft Loves Linux campaign they ran in like 2015 or something like that. They really were going after, we're not just Windows, we're Linux friendly. We go where the customers are too. And so it kind of meshed philosophically at the time with what we were doing.
I see. And after the acquisition, you worked at Microsoft for around 5 years, right?
Yep.
How is it different from running a company like on the executive level?
Oh my gosh. I think the biggest lesson for me was what becomes, this is not a criticism of Microsoft, this can be true of any organization at all, let alone one of that scale. Learning how to work within an organization that big is almost more important because getting the right resources, getting support, getting visibility, getting ability to hire people, getting whatever, you have to learn how to do that. And Microsoft Salesforce, I did get this advice early on, it was key. Microsoft Salesforce has a massive library of things they could and should be selling. And so getting their attention, so the salespeople actually even talk to the customers you want them to talk to that know about your product to tell them. And so a lot of my job there became not just driving the product vision, but became essentially evangelizing to Microsoft Salesforce and others, partner people, et cetera, what we did, why we did it, why it was valuable. And so I would often focus on the economics. I'd come in and say, an HPC contract might take much longer to win, but it's going to be millions of dollars. And so it's worth the effort. And then we had to educate Salesforce on what that even means, things like that. Not educate because they don't know what they're doing, but like sometimes you get these niche workloads. Like why would they?
You have to just convince them.
Yeah, and then help them. Here's how you can recognize who the right opportunities are, things like that. So, but yeah, I think working within a company like Microsoft, and then also being prepared for how slow it can be. Again, not because of criticism of them, but because the coordination among so many more people. Yeah. But that said, I was shocked in a good way. I was really not shocked. I was very happily surprised. The quality of the people there, the focus on impact, like so much of the dysfunction that can happen at a large company, I think they actively fight against. And so I was actually quite happy. I think Jason and I left, and maybe like one or two other people, but basically the whole team's still there. There's still work, Cycle Cloud, still product. Some of them moved to other key roles. So like I think as far as the fact that we're coming up on 8 years later, almost to the day, and the most of the team is still there, I think speaks to how good that kind of mesh was.
I see. And why did you and Jason leave Microsoft and start? How'd you get into like Anaconda?
Yeah, so Anaconda, I had actually known the co-founders of Anaconda from before they started it.
Yeah.
And encouraged them because I was already at Cycle. And so Peter Wang, one of the co-founders of Anaconda, I gave him his first job out of college in the late 90s. So I had known him for a while. We would compare notes on our journeys of what are your challenges. They were VC funded and we were bootstrapped and we were different spaces but tangential. We even worked together a couple times on customers. So I'd always been kind of aware of them, advising them, cheering them on, things like that. Jason had left. I don't want to go too much into his details, but I think my interpretation when I left was honestly he was just burned out. The cycle journey was so intense, and it's really intense when you're like there were times where like as founders we would meet and be like, well, not sure we're going to make payroll. What do we do? And those kinds of worries just wear on you. And then the acquisition process itself was so arduous. That's the other thing, by the way, I would tell people is that stuff sounds great, but the number of acquisition discussions that fail is huge. You don't hear about them, right? It can be a huge emotional energy sink. Yeah. And so, and the start of a discussion is the start of the journey. You should be, somebody who's in that at a startup, you should be careful about which of those you actually even engage in. But anyway, back to Jason. So I think he was just burned out and needed some time to rest. And then COVID hit and kind of threw everything in things. For me, it was a similar thing. I had read early on a piece of advice, which was you can have 10 years of experience or you can have 1 year of experience that you repeat 9 more times. And my thing was as long as I was learning and growing and kind of feeling like I'm really challenging myself, I was happy. And after the time at Microsoft, I kind of started feeling like I'm really good at my job, but I wouldn't say phoning it in, but it's not challenging me in that way anymore. And I also was like, I'm still young, I have the energy, I could do other challenges. I'm not ready to settle, if you make it. And so it was very hard to walk away from the team, but it just felt like I need to get out of my comfort zone and I need to lean into that discomfort. And that's actually a piece of advice that it kind of hit me recently. In general, you should always find the discomfort and lean into it, always. And so Anaconda had a reorganization, and they had an opening at an executive level, and they called me and said, we know you're not looking for a job, but this we think you'd be great and everything. And I was like, you know what? They're in a different space. It's different enough that it really will force me completely out of my comfort zone, but it's similar enough that it's not like I'm starting from scratch and it's overwhelming or anything like that. And so it felt like a perfect chance. Plus, some of the challenges that they had were challenges that I was excited to try. We were 30 people when we got acquired by Microsoft, and then the team at Microsoft was big, but still going from managing a team. Let's say it was 30 people to running an engineering org with 300 people was a nice challenge, and it worked out exactly like I thought. That was a very intense ride in Anaconda. They recently announced that they raised their Series C funding and got unicorn status and all that stuff, and that was one of my major accomplishments while I was there, but I couldn't talk about it until they announced it publicly. But yeah, that's why I left Microsoft. If I don't start getting out of my comfort zone now, I might never get out of my comfort zone. And then that was actually part of the reason to then leave Anaconda was we had this intense journey towards that accomplishment. It kind of rebuilt the engineering organization, helped rebuild the company, et cetera. And I was exhausted. I needed a break. And it felt like, look, we've just raised a ton of money. We have our product, kind of technical strategy. We have started on the engineering culture. There's all these things I felt like were in motion. And it felt like, okay, now's a good time for me to take a break. So I intended to take a much longer break than I did. But the AI space felt like it was moving so fast and it was so exciting. And Jason had what I thought was another great idea. He had another great person that he had already kind of connected with. And it felt like, well, I could rest or I could cut my rest short, but again, jump into the fray. Yeah. So no regrets. Although I do think at some point I will take a longer rest. But that's why I made each transition.
So speaking of the AI break, right? Like the whole AI thing, right? How was it? Like first time, like Anaconda was your first time dealing with AI was it
sort of? So we did AI workloads at Cycle, but we were the infrastructure side. So if you were a huge company trying to train a model of some kind, we would help deploy and run and operate those clusters for you to do that. Yeah. So I was aware of how they were running these workloads and was aware of what's going on. But yeah, I'm not. You're
not in the direct like.
Yeah, I wasn't like an AI researcher doing that kind of stuff. And so that was part of what drove me to Anaconda was like, again, I'm familiar with. There's a Venn diagram. There's a huge overlap. Yeah. With all this part around the AI specific stuff, I don't actually know as intimately as I would like, and this is going to be how I did it. So yeah, it was a drinking from the fire hose moment. I treated it a bit like I did when I went to college. It was like I have to catch up, which probably didn't help with the feeling of being tired and burned out. But it was exciting, which helped.
Yeah, and what's your opinion on the AI space, like how fast it's moving? And like, as you said, you have experienced the .com crash, right? And many people say that the AI space is a bubble right now. What's your opinion on that?
Ooh. I do. I think the hype has gotten out of control, and I do suspect there's a bubble. That always kind of happens when there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of opportunity, because people just go into the opportunity, but you don't know how things are going to shake out. As far as I am a believer in the technology. I find it frustrating when people kind of throw away the whole thing as like, oh, it hallucinated a few times, it's useless. But at the same point, the claims that people are making are like a bit wild. And I guess one of the key things there is always look what people are doing, not what they're saying. Yeah. And so, for instance, if some tech CEO is saying AI is going to replace all software developers, and then you look on their corporate website and they have an opening for 200 job postings for software developers, which one is it? Because it's going to take you months to hire and onboard those people, and if in 6 months AI is going to replace them, what are you doing? So clearly there's a disconnect there. That said, I do think the technology is a fundamental shift, and so looking at that and saying, oh, well, they're clearly lying, AI is not that important is the other thing. So we are kind of AI native, the latest startup, and we focus on just evaluating things. What is the value we're getting out of this? What is the cost for doing it? That said, I think there are a lot of companies out there that don't have much differentiation and don't have much value add over what the foundational models are putting out. And I also think I think it's similar to the early Uber days when you get a taxi ride super cheap because you weren't really paying the full cost. Yeah. And so I do suspect at some point there's going to be a bit of a pricing adjustment. that everybody keeps talking about the price of inferencing going down by 10 times every year, sure, but the amount of inferencing people want to do keeps going up, so I'm not sure how that curve bends out. But I do know, I think right now there's still bottlenecks around power, literally like electricity to power the data centers, infrastructure itself, et cetera. So I think the ride's going to keep going for quite a long time.
How close do you think we are to like AGI or like pure AGI?
I think we're far. I think we're far.
Do you think we're going to reach it in the next foreseeable future?
Well, foreseeable's a long time. I'll go out on a limb and say by 2030, no. I'm not sure how I would define AGI in a way that's particularly useful. I think the idea that you're going to have ex machina Terminator type machines where they're like thinking, data from Star Trek, pick your sentient robot. I'm not sure that that's true. Also, I think some of these problems like robots and whatnot are way harder. I think than they seem. It's I don't want to say it's easy. It's not easy, but there are things that you can demo when you're optimizing for a specific problem. You can sometimes solve that problem. Generalizing past that is extremely difficult, and so I think there's a lot of demos that are great, and I haven't seen evidence yet that it generalizes broader. But that said, if all progress on AI stopped today, it would be years of disruption coming as what's capable today gets integrated across technology, society, businesses, and everything else. So again, getting back to the kind of numerism side, I think the world's going to keep getting to be a better place for quite a while, even if there's no more progress.
So you think the potential for AI hasn't been completely reached yet?
Not at all.
Yeah, that's a really common sentiment across everyone that I've interviewed so far. And you've been a startup advisor after working at Anaconda. Mm-hmm. What drew you to that? What are some of the mistakes you see many startup people make?
Man, I mean, what drew to me was I appreciated people who. I always liked having coaches and people that give me feedback and whatnot. And I really like the idea that if I have suffered to learn something, that if I can save somebody else some of that. I mean, sometimes suffering is, I don't want to say required, but it seems to be a necessary part of learning. Practicing and failing until you get it right. But I still think there's a lot of mistakes that people can avoid, a lot of unnecessary pain people can avoid that people who have learned those lessons can help impart. And so some of it was just paying it forward. I got some great people helping me and I just wanted to help others. Some of it was, I find some of these topics fascinating. And so sometimes it's even just a discussion. I don't have an answer, but I can help somebody think through things, or I can be a sounding board. And sometimes being a startup founder is really hard. Being an early engineer, being an early employee is really hard. There's so many areas that are just challenging, and I think we can do a lot more to support each other. And so I wanted to basically do all that. And then some of it was, people would hear some of these stories and they were interested and they asked questions. And I'm a social person, so I like meeting people and talking. And so the kind of, intersection of all those things meant that, sometimes I'd get involved and help people as much as I could.
Yeah. And what are some of the mistakes? What are some common mistakes? I mean, even you've made some. You've mentioned that you've made a lot.
It's funny, on a social side, I've watched I'll say my parents or other people's parents, but you watch people make mistakes, and you're like, I'm not going to make that mistake, and it's like I look forward to making entirely new mistakes. So there's an aspect of as much as I'm saying, don't make these mistakes, I'm sure if you look at what I'm doing, I'm making other ones right now. The big ones for me are on a business side, focusing on understanding your customers, understanding their problems, and then helping them truly solve them. It's such a trite thing to say, but being customer focused and whatnot is, I guess the difference is understanding your customers and really understanding what they're trying to accomplish, why they're trying to accomplish it, so that you can truly help them. And it's tough to do, and in the engineering side, it's very easy to get caught up in the coolness of technology. So I think it was Humane, they had that AI pin device.
Yeah.
And it failed, and somebody, I believe on Twitter or something like that, was defending it. Like, do you realize how impressive the engineering was to get this and that form factor and this and this and this, and they listed all these technologies, and it's like,
it's not useful.
Who cares? No customer cares about that. They care, does this solve the problem I have? And so at the end of the day, our first startup, we were so caught up in the coolness of the technology, and it took us a while to realize, oh no, we have to go talk to people and find out how this actually helps them. And so I'd say always focus on your customers, and by the way, that doesn't mean parroting what they say. Sometimes they don't know what to ask for. So I guess listen to their problem, understand their pain, usually disregard their solution, because a lot of times their conception of how to solve the problem is limited by their experience And so if you have a broader perspective, you can think of a new way to solve the problem. So yeah, the business side is that. On the social side, I'll go on a limb here. I am not a fan of the like 996, like you should be sleeping at your desk, live your startup life. I did that. And first of all, you have health impact from that like I'm still dealing with that kind of stuff. You're also not operating at your best. If you are doing work that requires your brain, you want your brain to be functioning at a high level. And if you are living on 4 hours of sleep and terrible food, you're not. And that's, maybe 90% of the problems you deal with don't require all of your mental faculties, but you're gonna hit those problems that do, and you're in a state where you're unable to solve them. But more than that, I think don't get me wrong, I work a lot. And I think you can do that in better ways, but approach it like a constraint. It helps with prioritization. The attitude I had when I was younger was, okay, well, if I'm working 90 hours, maybe I need to work 100. And what would have been better is no, I'm gonna stay 90, but if I have 10 new hours of work, what 10 am I throwing off the plate so that I can get that other work done? And what you end up doing is it forces you to understand what are your top priorities and then to focus on them. And you can kind of bring more to yourself to those. So again, I'm not saying you shouldn't work hard. I'm not saying it won't end up being tremendous work, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I know, again, trite thing to say, but the way I look at it is this. Sprinters, however fast they're running for 100 meters, great. When I was younger, I thought long distance runners ran slow. Like I thought like a marathon runner was running slowly for 27 miles or whatever it is. No, they're still running a 5-minute mile, but they're not running a 4-minute mile. Yeah. And so when you're at a startup, you have to be at the 5-minute mile pace. So it's still faster than 99% of the people out there, but it's not at the pace where you are going to burn yourself out and you can't work anymore. So treat it like a constraint. Set boundaries, make room for family, make room for what social needs people have, and ruthless prioritization of what is the most important thing I can be working on right now, and make sure that you stay focused on that. Otherwise, you're going to burn yourself out. Like I said, health impacts, and you're not going to be doing your best work. We actually had a rule at our first startup at Institute where we kicked people out because the quality of their work was so bad when they were exhausted, they were causing more bugs than they were fixing. So that's a really easy one to think of. And again, it's very hard to do in the moment, but truly try and set a boundary, like I'm going to work from 9 a.m. to, well, let's say 9 p.m., whatever, 12-hour day, and then operate within that. So yeah, sorry, one other thing. Who you work with matters a lot. Like, it's much, 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 much better to have a small, high-performing team than to have a larger team that isn't, and making sure that you have shared values and a shared understanding. A well-functioning team will outperform stellar engineers that aren't functioning as a team any day of the week. Sorry, I'm very engineering focused, but as you said, it applies to the whole company.
Of course. Now, I was laughing at the working thing because, like, not to overplay myself, but I think I'm a really hard worker. I was up at 2 a.m. the other day trying to fix a bug, so I've just been, like, this whole summer, I've just been working 24/7 and not doing anything else, so I just think that's funny. And
you can, like I said, I lived that life for a long time, and it's definitely something you can do.
And I just genuinely enjoy it, so I find it really
That's
hard.
good though. So that's the thing about if you're excited about the mission, it doesn't feel as much like work.
Yeah.
I will say the difference with the startup maybe is that eventually you're going to be forced to do things that don't give you that excitement, that aren't fun, that aren't whatever. And I took too much pride in being a machine that could just push through things, and I think that was a damaging.
I think personally one of my biggest problems is I only work on what I feel like working on, and if I don't, like, if I like doing what I'm doing, I'll keep working on it like endlessly. Like,
that was a tip I got from an executive was once you get to a certain level, which honestly I think is a lot lower than what they were talking about. Once you get to a certain level, there is always more work that you could possibly do.
Yeah, exactly.
And so their way of dealing with the stress, the burnout, everything else was try to focus on the work that gives you energy.
Yeah. Because
that's how you can power through 60, 70, 80-hour weeks.
Yeah.
Plus, you want it to feel like it's worth sacrificing. If you're going to miss your friend's birthday party, it's because you're doing exciting work, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot easier than if you're working on some whatever.
Yeah, no, I got that feeling like around the middle of summer. I think I got way too much stuff to do. That's why it's not hired. I mean, we just recruited 6 people for the executive team for my nonprofit.
Nice.
Just because I was doing most of the work there, and I was like, there's no way I can.
That's another key thing. When you're going to hire people, make sure that you have a very clear reason of why you're going to hire them. I don't care how much funding you have. One of the things I think that gives us strength at my current startup is having bootstrapped. We have this very cheap shoestring DIY ethos that even though we have funding, we are very, very capital efficient.
Yeah.
And when it comes to hiring, it's like a very clear, I'm doing this work. I should be doing this work that for me is a higher value thing for me to do. So now I'm going to bring in somebody to do this. We made this mistake early on, and I've seen plenty of other friends companies make this mistake where they kind of feel like, oh, we're a certain size, we should have more people.
Yeah.
Or, but I think that culture has changed, right? For a while, the whole hyperscalers are willing to be hiring and growing, and now it's much more about revenue per head count, things like that, which again, as a bootstrapper was like, of course. But yeah, so I would say you're doing the right thing, which is, okay, I'm so overloaded, I need to offload this to somebody, and then it also gives you a clear idea of the kind of person you need and what their success criteria looks like.
Yeah.
When I hire people, I try to be very clear about here's how we're going to judge your performance, here's what we expect you to do. I try to describe what's a day in the life of the job like for you, so that they have a clear understanding of what they're getting into. But also it proves to me that I've thought about this and I know what I need then.
Yeah.
Let me throw one other thing out there related to hiring. You have to fire people that aren't working out. Hear that over and over again.
That was something I was going to talk about.
To do it, you have to, and you should do it humanely. I am a firm believer that people should never be surprised when they get fired. They may disagree.
Yeah.
My performance is great, which is why you want to try and quantify things. But in general, no one should be surprised. But if they're not working out, they need to go.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how many times I've learned that lesson. But again, do it humanely as you can. Do it as considerately as you can. The advice I got, which I liked, was the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. Jonah Hill's asking about how to fire him, and Brad Pitt says, if you got shot, would you want like 5 shots to the stomach, or do you want 1 to the head? And it's kind of a wild way to describe it. But the point was, be direct. Hey, it's not working out. Blah blah blah. You're done. Yeah. Anything else just delays the pain, makes it much more awkward. And this gets back into leaning into the discomfort. If you're avoiding those conversations because you don't want to have a rough conversation with somebody, if you're not giving them feedback because you don't want to hurt their feelings or whatever, you're not doing them any favors. And you need, as anybody working with somebody, hiring somebody, you need to get over the discomfort of giving people feedback. Again, there are ways to do it humanely, ways to do it clearly, but you need to lean into that. Otherwise, it's going to end up in a very bad situation.
That's very relatable. Before I hired all my executives, right, I had a huge team of actual executives, like the original founding team, and I got rid of all of them because they just didn't show commitment. I think that was something I wanted to talk about as well. So yeah, thank you so much for.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You asked about bad advice.
The worst advice, yeah.
Oh man.
It's all right. I was about to bring that up, but.
The worst advice, I haven't. Oh man, most of the advice I got was advice that sounded good, but it wasn't applicable to our situation. I would say that. So one thing, the early investors we had in Immersive, not a judgment of them as people, but they weren't software people. They didn't understand enterprise sales. They couldn't really help with the industries we were in. They had their money was from different areas, and so at the end of the day, a lot of their advice just wasn't applicable to us. But it also caused friction because when we talked about, well, here's how the sales cycle for enterprise sales works to like an automotive company, it was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean it's a 9-month sales cycle? And so I think finding advisors, finding investors, things like that, where they understand what you're doing and that you can go to them so that their advice is applicable helps. I guess it's like if you were trying to go be like an Olympic strongman, but you went to a long distance running coach as your coach. Like you went to the wrong person. They're going to give you advice. It'd be great if you want to be a long distance runner, but it's not going to help you, whatever, get on the gold medal platform for clean and jerk or whatever the Olympics are. And so, or let's say sprinter versus long distance runner, keep the same sport. So for us, a lot of the bad advice came down more to that. I wouldn't say it's bad advice, but you hear a lot of things in the industry that are common wisdom or common trends. And I think you really have to think close about how does this apply to us in our situation. And make sure that you're not, I don't know what the correct way to say this is, but you'll sometimes get advice where you're told to do something, and so you kind of go through the motions, but there's no understanding of why you're doing it. And so you can mimic the steps that somebody else took. You'll see this a lot. Like somebody will write a profile of the founders of some company, and then you'll start doing the things that those companies. Valve made a ton of money. They wrote like, here's how we run our culture. We have no corporate structure. We do da-da-da-da. And it's like, will that work for them? Or does that work for a small software company that has $1 billion in revenue? And we're not a small software company with $1 billion in revenue. So you have to be very careful to not look at the steps or the processes of the organizations or whatever that somebody else did and then think that's the way to do it. There was an early, I can't remember his name, but I want to say he was early Google, early Facebook, and I think early Twitter, I believe. And in an interview, he was saying how when he left Google, it was like, that's how you run a company. They have cracked the code. And then he went to Facebook and was like, wow, that couldn't be more different. That's how you run a company. And then finally was like, oh my God, there is no one way. And so parroting and copying how those companies have done it is just gonna fail you. So look at what they do, try and understand why that worked for them, see what the similarities are to your company, and then any advice you get, put through that same filter. What does this mean for us? Are we in the same situation? Can we even do these same things? And so I don't think you'll get bad advice so much as you'll get advice that's applicable or not, or it needs to be applied to your specific situation.
All right. Thank you so much for that. That was some great advice. And I think anyone that's watching has learned a lot from this. And
I hope so.
yeah, of course. That was so insightful, genuinely.
You asked earlier about how I get into advising. Like clearly, I have such trouble talking about
You've got experience.
But yeah, I hope I can help. I do also want to say I highly support this stuff. I think especially in the world with all the changes going on, get comfortable with taking risks. You should absolutely start things, try things, just do things. There's so much more agency available to people than I think they realize, than I realized. And the fact that you're all doing this in your audience, I think you're all probably well on your way there anyway. But yeah, keep going.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.